Welcome to Veterans Chronicles. I'm Greg Corombos. Our guest this week is retired U.S. Navy Rear Admiral and Naval Aviator Robert Shumaker. He's also a veteran of the Vietnam War and spent more than 8 years as a prisoner of war there. And Admiral Shumaker, thank you very much for being with us today.
You bet. Pleasure to be here.
Where were you born and raised, sir?
I was born in western Pennsylvania, a town called Newcastle, north of Pittsburgh. And when I was a teenager, my family, which consisted of my father, who was a lawyer, my mother was a writer, and I had an older sister and a younger brother. But when I was a teenager, we moved north about 10 miles to a small college town called New Wilmington, where Westminster College is located. And I attended public schools there and just really enjoyed it. We lived on a farm outside of town, and I got exposed to milking cows and driving tractors, and it was an enjoyable part of life.
It's a good childhood.
You bet.
What drew you to the Naval Academy?
Well, I had an uncle that was a Marine captain, and he was killed at Midway, and I was kind of named after him. So that was one incentive. And then I had an Aunt Edna, who sent me a subscription to a Boy's Life, it was called. It's a magazine, I think, associated with the Boy Scouts. And in one issue, in a centerfold, it said Annapolis and West Point, where boys become admirals and generals. Well, now girls become admirals and generals as well. But anyway, those two influences, I guess, drove me toward the Naval Academy.
And ultimately, at least now, I don't know if it was the same way then, when you're commissioned, you get to choose which area of service you want to go into. Why did you pick flying?
Well, again, probably the relatives, my Marine uncle. And also I had another aunt who was in the WASPs. And in World War II, that stood for Women Air Service Pilots. And these were 1,000 women that would fly airplanes from the factories out to airfields and thereby relieve men for combat. So I think that influenced me toward aviation.
And once you were commissioned, where did you go from there?
Well, I went back to the Naval Academy for a short time as a company officer, but then eventually wound up in the Navy flight training program, which starts off at Pensacola, Florida, for the basic work, and then moves on to, in my case, to Chase Field in Beeville, Texas. And
what were you flying at that point?
Well, they started off in this was a long time ago, of course, in T-34s, and then into T-28s, and then into TVs, they were called. That was the transition into jet training, and then into Cougar jets. And then eventually, when I was through with my training, I went into more training in Jacksonville, Florida. And it was a transition squadron called, it was for transitioning into the F-8 Crusader, which was a single-seat, single-engine fighter that could go 1,000 miles an hour.
How did you like flying that one?
Loved it, yeah, I loved it. And it was a tricky airplane. I remember in one of my early flights, I got it into a spin, and it made 14 revolutions with fire coming out the front end, and I was in the clouds all this time. So it was pretty exciting, but I got it out.
Until now, it's been a few decades, but you're still pretty excited about that bird.
Oh, yeah, and I'm still flying airplanes.
Are you?
At 86.
Fantastic. Absolutely love it. Well, there's a couple important parts of your naval career, even before we get to Vietnam, that I want to highlight. One was a harrowing mission in the Mediterranean. Explain what happened there.
Well, again, it was with a Crusader, and it was off of the USS Saratoga. And I was flying at night, and I came into land. Navy planes get stopped by a hook in the back of the airplane, and unfortunately, through a mechanical malfunction, the hook wouldn't come down. And so after 3 attempts, the air boss by radio told me to join the tanker, get some fuel, and head for Italy. So this is a story kind of like baseball, where 3 strikes and you're out. Only this is 4 strikes. So the first strike was the hook not coming down. The second strike was the hose wouldn't come out of the refueling tanker. The third strike was trying to put it into the barricade, which is like a big tennis net. But unfortunately, the arms, we call them stanchions, would not erect to the vertical position. And so I got it up to 4,000 feet and bailed out. And everything's supposed to be automatic. The chute opens and all. Well, the chute didn't open. So I fell from 4,000 feet down to about 2,000 feet and pulled the D-ring, which is an alternate way of opening the chute. And again, it didn't open. So I figured I'm dead for sure. Finally pulled it out with both hands, and it opened up. And that all happened in about 10 minutes' time.
You mentioned the challenges that you had in that particular mission, landing on the aircraft carrier, but that's a challenge in and of itself, even on a normal landing. So explain how that works and how long it took you to get used to that.
Well, we go through a lot of training, and these are very expensive airplanes. In those days, they were $2 million airplanes, which are considerably more now. But you practice on land with you're given some assistance by an LSO, standing for Landing Signal Officer. And so they talk you down, and again, you're flying angle of attack mostly, and line up. And, if you play this thing right, carriers in my day had 6 arresting wires that were probably about 50 feet apart. And if you flew this thing just right, and just right meant you used a mirror landing system. It was a large mirror that was gyroscopically stabilized, so as the ship moved around, the mirror did not. And you would get a big blob of light in the center of this mirror, and you'd fly hoping to keep that blob of light, we call the meatball, right in the center. And if you were successful in doing that, you'd pick up number 3 wire every time.
You graduated from the Naval Academy in 1956.
True.
And so that's just a couple of years before the space race really starts to heat up, and you advanced pretty far in the NASA astronaut program. How did you get connected in it, and what was that process like?
Well, I think I got nominated by my commanding officer, but it produced a lot of candidates, but there were 4 criteria. You had to be younger than 35, you had to be have at least 1,000 hours of jet time, you had to have at least a bachelor's degree in engineering, and 4, you had to be shorter than 6 feet tall to fit in the thing. So they had a number of screenings, and they were going to pick 14 for the Apollo project. And so I made it through a number of screenings down to 32, from which they were going to pick the 14. And I got selected, but I had to go through a lot of physical examinations. And I think it was about a 10-day physical examination in Texas. And at the very end, they said, well, we see a shadow in some lymph nodes. And this was kind of embarrassing and that disqualified me. By the way, the guy that took my place was a guy named Roger Chaffee, who was later killed in a explosion on Apollo 1. But what's embarrassing is, in those days, there were nothing but men on aircraft carriers. And my lymph nodes were swollen because of what they call mononucleosis, known otherwise as the college kissing disease. So I had a little trouble explaining that anomaly to my friends, but anyway, that kept me out of the program.
There's more than one way to get mono.
I suppose, yeah.
The lesson from that story.
Yeah, right.
How did you react to getting so close to being part of the Apollo program and being projected?
Well, it was a real letdown, and I just really felt dejected and things, but that happens to people in life, and it's how you recover, what kind of resiliency you have after a defeat. And later on, as a prisoner of war, there were a lot of times when we were beaten down, and you just had to rely on your resiliency and your background to overcome those defeats.
Let's move on to the Vietnam War now. When exactly were you deployed there?
I was deployed fairly early in the game in 1965 aboard the aircraft carrier Coral Sea, and I was in a squadron called the Black Sheep Squadron. We pulled into, I got married just shortly before the deployment to a Canadian lady to whom I'm still married. And we had a baby in the first year of our marriage. And the baby was only 3 weeks old when I got shipped out. And so as we're steaming west heading for Vietnam, the carrier broke down with a mechanical problem and had to put into Pearl Harbor, and my wife was able to get tickets with our baby over to see me. And I was thinking, boy, this cost $600. That's a lot of money. But in the light of what later happened, it was the best investment we ever made, because she then had to raise this baby all by herself.
Sir, we're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back with much more of our conversation with retired U.S. Navy Rear Admiral and Naval Aviator Robert Shumaker, veteran of the Vietnam War, and spent more than 8 years as a prisoner of war. We'll get into all of that when we come back on Veterans Chronicles. We are back on Veterans Chronicles. I'm Greg Corombos, honored to be joined in studio today by retired U.S. Navy Rear Admiral and Naval Aviator Robert Shumaker. He's also a veteran of the Vietnam War and spent more than 8 years as a prisoner of war. And Admiral, when we left off, you had just been deployed to Vietnam, leaving a young wife and newborn son at home. And the day that changed your life is February 11th, 1965. And this is shortly after Gulf of Tonkin and the ramp-up of U.S. military operations in Vietnam.
Right, and the event that torched off the sequence of things was an attack by the North Vietnamese against some American soldiers at a hotel, and they killed, as I remember, 8 of them, and so that caused us to retaliate from 2 carriers, and so I was assigned to be a photo escort, which meant that after all the bombs were dropped and everything, then the photo plane, which was also a crusader, would make a pass over to get bomb damage assessment, and then he needed some fighter protection, so I and several others were assigned to escort him through. So anyway, as we're patrolling back and forth off the coastline, I saw that the Vietnamese were shooting at us, and so I made what they call a combat turn. I was flying on my skipper's wing. He was a Navy commander, and in a combat turn, you slide, and there's a danger of losing sight of each other as you slide through. And I lost him, and I said, I lost you, where are you? He said, I'm right behind you. And I was right at the point where I was about to roll in. So I rolled on in, and it was kind of a bad day weather-wise, about 2,000-foot ceiling. And as I rolled in, it was machine gunning this building, and I got hit in the tail section. The airplanes don't fly very well with holes in them, and this thing flipped upside down and pointed straight down, and I keyed down on my mic, intending to say 403, I'm hit. And if I had completed that sentence, I'd never make it out, because then I ejected, and this time, fortunately, the parachute opened quickly, but only 35 feet over the ground. And we were taught when we land to distribute the shock of landing by the 7-point distribution, where you land on your feet and immediately roll sideways to your knees and your hips and things. So I perfected the 1-point landing, which was right on my bottom, and consequently I'm about an inch shorter than I was intended to be. But anyway, I was concealing myself, and after probably about an hour or so, I heard this horde of Vietnamese people. Some were peasants, some were soldiers, and they were beating through the bushes saying "Anglais, Anglais," which, there was a 100-year period before this when the French were involved in Vietnam. So that was their way of saying Englishman. And they all passed me by, and I figured, well, now I didn't have a personal radio, which later people had, but I figured I could make it to the coast and maybe escape. Anyway, one soldier kind of turned around, he had his AK-47, and he saw me, and it was a duel that I didn't want to participate in, so he had me, and they captured me and marched me on off to a large convention hall, and eventually out on the sand dunes to a shooting squad, where I was sure they were going to shoot me. They had an officer and 4 soldiers, and I was thinking, hey, I broke my back in landing, and I was thinking, hey, it's only going to hurt like going to the dentist, it'll be over with soon. But fortunately, they didn't pull the triggers and put me in a Jeep-like vehicle And 2 days later, up the bumpiest road you could possibly imagine, I made it up to Hanoi.
And it was about that time that they tried to use you as propaganda, correct?
Yeah, that was their whole scheme. The truth of the matter is we didn't really carry that much military information into battle with us, about where the next target was or anything like that. And at that time, the Vietnamese weren't really smart enough to really press us for information. And initially, they weren't torturing. But it seemed kind of silly. I'd go to this quiz room. We call them quizzes. And you'd sit on a concrete block, and it was really important for the interrogators to be seated at a higher level than you at a table. This would go on for hours, and they'd be ranting on about the history of Vietnam and what more. I remember one time, you see, we're obliged to give only minimal information in that situation. It's called the Big Four. It's called the name, rank, serial number, and date of birth. And I stuck to that. And after a while, though, the questions they were asking me were kind of silly, and they had copies of Time magazine, Newsweek, and things that had write-ups of me in there. And so they wanted to know how many chickens my father owned. Well, my father was a Harvard Law graduate and had a nice law practice, but he didn't own any chickens. But I didn't see any. This went on for a couple of days, and I didn't see anything wrong with telling him that he had 35 chickens, complete fabrication. But when I got back to my cell, I thought, boy, that is a big mistake I just made. I crossed the line of the Big Four, and I decided from then on, if they wanted information, they were going to have to force it out of me, and they did.
I read at one point, I don't know if it was this particular media event, if you want to call it that, where they kept asking you questions and you ended up talking about the evils of communism. Was that the same event?
There were quite a number of events. I tried to play the dumbest guy they'd ever captured. If you try to match wits with them, they've got you outgunned. So I kind of refrained from getting into long conversations with them. They had trouble with their English, and they would prevent us from learning anything about how to speak Vietnamese, because I guess they figured that we would learn things about our imprisonment and whatnot. So their whole philosophy of imprisonment, and we learned this as time went on, was to separate the prisoners so they couldn't talk or communicate with each other. And in our cells they were concrete cells. The ones I spent most of my time in were 4 feet wide and 9 feet long, and probably about 12 feet high. And up at the top of the ceiling would be a loudspeaker where they would play for sometimes 4 hours a day their propaganda and their form of music and things. But we can get into this later if you like. We thwarted them by developing a technique for communicating.
Absolutely. That's definitely one of the things I want to get into. Did they provide any care for your broken back?
Well, what they did was they told me that I complained because I had trouble sitting up. I think it was a compression fracture that I had. And so they used the term that lenient and humane treatment of the Vietnamese people will take you to a hospital. So they got me back in my flying outfit and then blindfolded me and put me in a blacked out Jeep and drove around and around and around and finally stopped about a block short of a building. And they said, there's the hospital. So and between me and the hospital were hordes of photographers with very expensive photographic equipment. And so I questioned whether I ought to participate in this thing, but my back was hurting so much, I decided to go up there. So we go inside this building. Here's this little wooden table with a woman that was dressed as a nurse and a guy who claimed to be a doctor. They had a stethoscope. And so he and all these photographers. And he said, what is the state of your father's health? And I said, well, that's not germane to things. And he smiled at the photographers and thumped my chest with his stethoscope. And then the English-speaking nurse said, the doctor said you will be feeling better in a few days, and out I go, without even an aspirin. So that was the medical treatment. It was my first introduction to the importance of psychological warfare, propaganda, and things.
You mentioned the dimensions of the cell. What were the other conditions like when you were first imprisoned?
Well, things changed around in 8 years' time. I was initially put into a much larger, I wouldn't even call it a cell, it was more of a room. And that went on for about 3 months or so. And I had a little wormhole through the wooden door where I could peek out into the courtyard and see part of the courtyard. And after it was either 2 or 3 months, I noticed that, once a day, the guard would come and open the door, and you take your sanitation bucket off about 100 yards or so and dump it into what was once a shower area. But I noticed through this wormhole that he was always methodical, and I would go to dump the bucket, and then another American would follow. It was the first American I'd seen in a number of months. So I tried to figure out a way to contact the guy. So someone had spilled some ink on the floor of my cell, and so I poured some water on it and kind of reconstituted it. And we had some kind of rough toilet paper, and I wrote this note. And the note simply said, "Welcome to the Hanoi Hilton. If you get this note, scratch your ear on the way out." And I cleaned up the story a little bit for the audience here. But so I was down there watching. Sure enough, I left the note there on my first trip, and he came back and he was scratching away, and that's how we made contact, and that's how the place got named the Hanoi Hilton.
Do you have any idea that it would ever become the more famous name for the prison than the name itself?
Well, no, not really, except that when I came back 8 years later in Los Angeles, there was a reception for California ex-POWs sponsored by Conrad Hilton himself. And I figured I'd at least get a nice free room out of him, but it didn't work out.
Admiral, let's pause again right there. We'll be right back with much more with retired U.S. Navy Rear Admiral and Naval Aviator Robert Shumaker. I'm Greg Corombos. This is Veterans Chronicles. This is Veterans Chronicles. I'm Greg Corombos. Thanks for being with us. Our guest this week in studio is retired U.S. Navy Rear Admiral and Naval Aviator Robert Shumaker. He's a veteran of the Vietnam War, and he also spent more than 8 years as a prisoner of war. We are just in the middle of that story right now. And, sir, I just want to get a little more detail on the conditions. You mentioned there's a sanitation bucket, so there's obviously no plumbing involved. Was there a mattress of any kind? And what kind of food were you given?
A lot of times it was very monotonous, and we knew we weren't getting a lot of nutrition because when we try to stand up from a seated position, we'd start to black out. So you learn to hold on to something until things cleared up. But for a long time, it would be pumpkin soup, and then one time for 6 months, it was cabbage soup. And now this is several years into our imprisonment, and right in the middle of an air raid, in 1967, the Americans were bombing the heck out of Hanoi several times a day, and right in the middle of one of these air raids, I heard an American voice, and I hadn't heard an American voice in several years at that time. And he was shouting as if he were talking to the pilots that were coming in an afterburner and guns blazing. And he was shouting, "Bomb the cabbage patches." So the food wasn't very good, really. But when they got a little crowded in this prison, this was the prison that the French had built. It was a city jail, and so they got a little crowded as more and more Americans arrived. And so they moved a couple of guys in with me, 3 guys in with me, and I was the senior guy as the lieutenant commander there. And I said, hey, they're going to try to separate us again to keep us from communicating, so let's figure out some way we can communicate. And we tried writing on these tin plates we had, and that wasn't very effective. And then this one guy named Harris came up with a scheme about tapping. And so we put the letters of the alphabet into a 5x5 square, leaving off the letter K. And so if you wanted to send a letter D, for example, it's in the first row in the 4th column. So you tap once, pause, like that. And you got pretty fast at this thing, sometimes maybe 4 or 5 words a minute.
Wow. How did you handle spaces between words?
We'd tap through concrete walls, and the receiver would usually take a little cup and put it against the wall, his ear against the wall to amplify things. And as you'd be working your way through this thing, as you got partway into a word, if the listener understood what the word was going to be, he'd give 2 taps and you'd move on to the next word. But no, you could figure it out pretty well the spaces.
What generally got communicated? Was it encouragement? Was it strategy, hope for getting out? What kind of things did you...
Well, it was that. We talked about everything, about building houses and about what it was going to be like when we got out, and how best to resist the torture sessions, things like that. And we just kind of supported each other. And later on, the Vietnamese, eventually there were 591 of us. But partway through, the Vietnamese thought they figured out who the leaders of this 591 were. And they segregated these guys. Admiral Stockdale was one of them. Admiral Denton, who was a senator, Congressman Johnson, and I was in this group too. And we were all kind of lined up in separate cells. So one guy, if you lock the doors of this room right here, you would find out that we all come to the party with a lot of background. And one guy knew a lot about fixing television, another about changing oil in cars. The guy next to me, who later turned out to be a congressman, wanted to speak French. So I would tap, I knew a little bit of French, and I could tap 5 words to him a day, and he would practice them over and over again. And in 3 years' time in this prison, it was called we called ourselves the Alcatraz 11. I never got more than 10 feet away from this guy, but there was a concrete wall that separated it, and I never saw him. But eventually, there was a rescue attempt over there called Santé, and that it was unsuccessful, but it caused the Vietnamese to take us out of solitary confinement and put us into a larger group. And there I met Congressman Johnson, who could speak better French than I could, and I never figured out to this day how that happened.
What difference did the tapping make in your morale, your mental condition over all those years?
Oh, it was our lifeblood. I mean, the Vietnamese thought that by separating us, they would pound into our brains through this loudspeaker how bad America was and how bad our social system was and all. And so this was our way of resisting all that. And it kept us going.
You mentioned that they figured out who they thought were the leaders. Was there some sort of organizational leadership structure going on there?
Oh, absolutely. And that kept us going. The most senior people, we were all military people, and we were trained in following the chain of command. And one of them says, if you're the senior guy, you take charge, and we did that. And that's certainly true of Admiral Stockdale and Denton. There were, of these 591, there were a few that misbehaved and were released early, and some of them kind of bought the Vietnamese propaganda, but very, very few of them. I think your audience would be proud of 98% of the group that was there.
Did you know about Admiral Denton famously blinking torture in Morse code during one of his propaganda moments?
Yeah, we learned about that, but of course, he didn't really know whether it was being received. He was blinking away there, but he didn't know whether the Americans would pick up on this. And unfortunately, they did. But as we tapped on the walls, he would tell us what he did, and we assumed that it would get across.
You were aware that at least tried to.
You bet.
So as we mentioned, when you were deployed, you've got this young wife and a young son at home. Now these years are going by here. What are you thinking? Are you thinking you will eventually get home when the war is over, or are you starting to wonder? Oh, yeah. Well, you never want to give up hope, And I remember in my cell, I would kind of Roman numeral numbers, 4 across, and I'd try to keep track of the days, and finally I ran out of space to do that. And then occasionally, I was tortured on 12 different occasions, and you lose track of time there. So I'd be off a couple of days, and tapping through the wall, a guy would correct me, it's Thursday, whatever date it was, But my wife was a Canadian. She's now a U.S. citizen, but
she raised our son. But in those days, the war was being displayed in the living rooms of the United States. And so she wouldn't let him watch television. And he had to learn to read early. And he became a pretty good student and eventually went to Harvard and Yale and is a neurosurgeon now.
You married the right woman.
Yeah, you bet.
You mentioned Congressman Johnson a moment ago that you were close with him. Which of the other prisoners did you forge the closest bonds with?
Well, John McCain, he and I, when they moved us after the Sante raid together, we were in a group of about 40 people, and John and I bonded together quite well. In fact, at one time he had a daughter and I had the son. The two fathers schemed to get the pair together as a marriage. It didn't work out, though.
It's a good effort, though.
Yeah.
The dowry didn't work out, apparently.
Right.
But one of the things we, of course, know is the torture that occurred there. Did that happen right away, or did it happen over time?
It happened over time. I think for the first year or so, there wasn't much torture. But then the Vietnamese would they'd kind of sneak up on you in the form of, if you refused to do something, which we would do, they would have you hold up the wall, is what we call it. So we'd face the wall and hold it like this, and hours and hours on end. In fact, I know one guy, one of the Alcatraz 11 guys, did it for, I think it was 5 or 6 days. You'd be surprised how heavy your arms get. And then, in my case, they put me on my knees, bare knees on the floor in handcuffs behind me, and they would. I'd have to, if I try to relax by leaning back on my haunches, they'd jab me with a bayonet, and that went on for 12 days. So, but the worst treatment of all was what we call the rope trick, and it was the situation where they get you seated on the floor, you'd be handcuffed behind your back, and then your elbows would be tied until they touched, until your sternum would almost pop, and then they'd take a rope from which this thing gets its name, and they would take it from your handcuffs up over your shoulders and down to your feet, and guards would keep your knees flat, and they'd have a leg iron keeping your feet. And it was just excruciating. And they shoved to keep me from screaming, they shoved an iron bar down my throat. And I still have trouble with my vocal cords because of that. So it was pretty grim.
Is it military training that keeps you going, and just being there for the other guy? I mean, that's...
Well, that all helps. But really, I think when it comes down to it, it's your own self-pride. You wanted to do this for yourself and for your family, and not let, in my case, the Navy down. So you have a lot of positive incentives to resist.
I read elsewhere of a couple other tactics they had. One was to give you no heat or blankets during winter. And another one I heard was that you had to kneel on broomsticks.
Hey, unfortunately, the rats keep getting bigger as the years go on, And sometimes these stories get exaggerated. And, I did have and it did get pretty cold over there, but I was never deprived of a blanket more than a couple of days. And in fact, there's a story going around about how Jane Fonda went over there and she met these guys all lined up, these POWs, and they each palmed off their names and stuff to her. And then, as the story goes, it turns out to be a false story. She turned the names over to the Vietnamese. But stories like that get exaggerated.
Well, the Jane Fonda reference brings up how politicized, of course, the Vietnam War became. Were you aware at all? Did they try to discourage you by letting you know about the protests and so forth and some of the...
Oh, absolutely. That's what came down through these loudspeakers. All the women strike for peace and everybody that was against the war, not everybody, but a lot of the people would make broadcasts that they would then broadcast to us. And then they had a Vietnamese woman that we call Hanoi Hannah, just like Tokyo Rose, that would read all the news about how many airplanes they shot down that day. And, it turns out that that was greatly exaggerated also.
Is that how Fonda got the nickname Hanoi Jane?
Yeah, you bet. Yeah, she's not very popular in our group.
You also spent, from what I've read, 3 years in solitary. and even a month in solitary is considered cruel and unusual a lot of the time. So describe that, if it's possible to put that into words.
Most of the day, like 16 hours, our feet would be bolted together they'd put clevises over each of our ankles and then slide a bar through there and lock it with a padlock. So you couldn't move around very much for 16 hours. But, we got pretty sneaky about things. And, we'd be tapping me to Johnson, there was a guy named Ron Stores that lived next to me that unfortunately died over there. But, we'd support each other just as much as we could. And it's amazing the power of your brain. I could relive events in my life, and remember classmates I had when I was in grade school, and then I decided I wanted to build a house for my wife, and so now this is 1965 economics, and I was going to build this mansion, newly married thing. It was going to cost $35,000, and so I'd solicit all kinds of information from people, and eventually built the house. Now it cost a little bit more than $35,000, but anyway, I have a lot of pride in that house.
Things like that would just keep your mind occupied and forward-looking for 3 years.
Yeah, but then we had duties to do too, and that we would remember the lists of POWs, because the Vietnamese would release the names of only about 1 out of every 3 POWs, and consequently wives back home, some of them remarried and were left without knowledge of their people. So we would memorize these names, these 591, in hopes that if we escaped, we'd carry that information out. Now it turns out that there was a guy there. He was a seaman. Most of these 591s were aviators and pilots, but this guy fell off a ship 6 miles out in the Gulf, swam ashore. The Vietnamese were sure that he was a CIA agent, but the guy had a photographic memory, and he was able to memorize all these names, and the Vietnamese decided they wanted to send him home early. He didn't want to go home, but the senior guys in his camp said, "You've got all this information." He goes home, and he gets a Greyhound bus ticket, goes all the way around the United States, stopping at the he had memorized not just the names, but the shoot-down dates, the next of kin, hometowns and things. So it makes you really proud of it. And the guy was probably only about 18 or 19 years old, too.
You mentioned the bracelet. I don't know if we can get a shot of that right now. Explain what those were. Yeah,
there were 2 college girls in the middle of all this experience in California that went to their professor and said, "We're concerned about what's happening to these POWs, and can we bring some attention to them?" And they came up with this idea of manufacturing some bracelets, and they were kind of chintzy little things here, and they sold them for $2 a piece, and they had stamped on them the name of a POW and their shoot down date, and they sold them for $2 a piece, and the recipient would say that they were going to wear these things until they knew what the fate of the guy on their bracelet was. And so when I returned, a lot of these people, and they sold, like I say, millions of them, and it did bring a lot of attention to our problems. But a lot of people, when I came back, would send their bracelets to me, and even here, years after my release, I still occasionally get a bracelet.
Do you wear it often?
Not really, but I do keep them in my my jewelry cabinet.
I bet your wife had one.
Yeah, I'm sure she did. Yeah.
Did you notice any changes in your captors over time, where, for the most part, as far as I know, no matter how much they tortured you, they didn't get much information out of anyone? I know Senator McCain famously said he gave them the Green Bay Packers offensive line when they asked for his crewmates and so forth. But what was it like with the captors?
Well, we're proud of, as Americans, that we don't lie, cheat, and steal, but that puts you at a disadvantage as a POW. So you learn to lie pretty quickly and remember these lies, because they would record all these things. So they wanted to know my job on the aircraft carrier, and so I told them after a long time that I was in charge of the pool tables. Well, that usually gets a chuckle, because they don't have pool tables on aircraft carriers. The walls don't stay stationary. But they started off with the privates from their army that were rejects, I guess. And the guard to prisoner ratio was about 2 guards to each POW. They would round the clock. They would have guards on us to keep us from talking mostly. But I didn't find many kind ones. And Admiral Denton put me in charge of naming these guards. It was important that we develop information on the guards, what their habits were, But with all these people reporting differently, you would never know who was who. So I was in charge of naming them, and I named them all after animals, and your audience wouldn't appreciate some of these names I gave them.
But they're memorable names, it sounds like.
Yes, they are indeed.
Oh, man. When did you start to get an idea that you might be getting free soon?
Well, after the Sante raid, they moved us back into the big quarters there. We sensed that something was up. I'll tell you a quick story. They got upset with us because we had a church service, and they hauled 3 guys off and put them in solitary for, I think it was about 6 weeks. But as they're being hauled off, one of the other guys started singing the Star Spangled Banner, and the whole camp joined in. They could hear us in downtown Hanoi singing the Star Spangled Banner. And after 6 weeks, when this guy came back, his name was Robbie Reisner, they asked him how it felt to hear the Star Spangled Banner after several years. And he said, I felt I could go bear hunting with a switch. He said, I felt like I was 9 feet tall. Well, there's a statue now on the Air Force Academy grounds. It happens to be 9 feet tall of General Reisner because Ross Perot dedicated that to him. But we started hearing things, and we didn't even know that the United States put a man on the moon, for maybe 2 years after the fact. But eventually they got us out in the courtyard, and by the rules or the protocols of this peace agreement, they were obliged to read it to us. I think they kind of expected us to hoop and holler, and we didn't. We just kind of filed back with a lot of dignity and decorum, and deprived them of that pleasure they might have. But anyway, it was a happy day for us, and they released us in 3 groups. I was in the first group with Admiral Denton, and Denton historically said to Admiral Geiler, who met us there, that just God bless America, and that seemed to really resonate.
Can you even put into words what it felt to breathe free air after 8 years?
Well, it is kind of hard, but because you don't appreciate freedom until you lose it. Now to regain it into a society that had changed a lot in 8 years' time, it took a little bit of accommodation on our part, but nonetheless, it felt so great coming back to my wife and son, who is now pushing 9, I guess. And I decided I wanted to go back to school, and so I went back and got a doctorate degree in electrical engineering, and then went into program management for a number of missiles that proved to be very effective. One was called the HARM missile, one was called the Maverick missile, and another's the Hellfire missile. These are all missiles that are produced by U.S. industry with guidance by the military. So I'm proud of that accomplishment. And later I became the superintendent of the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, California, where naval officers and some foreign officers, some Army officers too, about 1,800 of them are working on their, usually their master's degrees.
Did you experience any of the anti-war hostility that some returning veterans received?
No, not really. My hometown in Pennsylvania had a welcoming parade, and so I was never exposed to the spitting or anything like that.
Were there any major challenges in readjusting to life back home?
Well, I no longer had the bucket I had there, but there were some adjustments, sure, but anyway, I think we overcame any problems we had.
One of the things that has always stood out to me, in fact, I think there was even a book about it, about leadership lessons from the Hanoi Hilton, is that so many of those prisoners, yourself included, and while I'm sure the physical and emotional scars continue, is how many came home and continued to strive, whether remaining in the service for several years, as you did. Others, as we've mentioned, went into public service. Others in business. It's remarkable how well this group thrived after such a horrific experience.
Yeah, I think so too. I think we're tougher as a result of it. Kind of like tempering steel, I guess. But we have people who went into religion and into politics, and some doctors and many lawyers. So they all acquitted themselves very well, I think.
You understand the concept of service probably better than the vast majority of people. For those who either haven't served or maybe don't think about it much, what does service mean to you, in particular your service?
Well, McCain used to talk about serving a purpose higher than yourself, and your willingness to sacrifice. I think it's important. And once you discover, as you get older, and I'm 86 years old now, is that it's not really money that you ought to strive for. It's just being integrity and honest and energetic and appreciative of what we have. And I think that'll carry you through a lot of ups and downs of life.
There's so many moments that we've talked about. Is there any moment that you're proudest of, either as a group or individually?
Well, I think I'm proud of being a member of the Alcatraz 11. We're down to 4 people left now because of deaths. But we hang together, and occasionally we have reunions. But I'm proud of the fact that I didn't cave in to the pressure that Vietnamese put on us. And there's some things that I'm not allowed to talk about because of security. But I'm proud of that because Admiral Stockdale put me in charge of external communications, but I can't reveal much beyond that.
A younger generation came to know Admiral Stockdale when he ran for vice president in 1992. Given his extraordinary leadership at the time, what was it like to see some folks almost mock him in that year?
Yeah, I feel kind of bad. My wife and I, with another couple, went to see the Capitol Steps, which is around Washington. It's a humorous group that posts a lot of fun, and they were poking fun at Admiral Stockdale, because he was a very deliberate man, a Socratic type of individual, and that kind of hurt. But he was a deep thinker, and he instituted a program called Back U.S., which we all took to heart over there. And it was BACK-US. It was don't bow to them, stay off the air, because he tried to get us to make broadcasts. Don't confess anything. Don't kiss them goodbye. And united we stand. So that was Back U.S.
Admiral, I can't thank you enough for your time with us today, and deeply grateful for your service to our country. Thank you, sir, very much for being with us.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Retired U.S. Navy Rear Admiral and Naval Aviator Robert Shumaker, veteran of the Vietnam War, spent more than 8 years as a prisoner of war in Vietnam. I'm Greg Corombos. This is Veterans Chronicles.